Welcome, everyone. I'm Connie Hunt-Ferrerini. I am an economist at the Glasgow College of Business and Entrepreneurship at Linwood University and the Associate Director for the Hammond Institute, which resides in the Glasgow College. And we are here to celebrate the Hammond Institute and its dedication to free enterprise. The mission of the Hammond Institute is to foster free enterprise and civil religious liberty through the examination of market-oriented approaches to economic and social issues. It is based on the view that a limited government, such as that laid out in the United States Constitution as a foundation, is a necessary component of a just and prosperous society. To examine market approaches to economic and social issues, the Hammond Institute fosters student and faculty engagement with the community through this Langenberg speaker series. In 2017, the series moved to the campus of Linwood University, and we have prized ourselves on bringing people together, students, faculty, and community members to hear leading intellectuals and engage with each other in a rational discussion in civil debate. People like Walter Williams, Jason Clemens, and others are a few but notable speakers of the past. Today we turn to Dr. Carden. He is a professor of economics at Samford University's Brock School of Business. His first book is co-authored with the esteemed Deirdre McCloskey. Tonight, Dr. Carden will present highlights from his co-authored book, Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich. How the Bourgeois Deal with Enriched, or How the Bourgeois Enrich the World. There we go. Excuse me, I had a little typo in it. Before we turn the discussion over to Art, let me share a little of his background. Art earned his bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Alabama. Later, he arrived on the campus of the Washington University to receive his PhD in economics. He serves in a variety of fellow positions. For instance, he is at the American Institute for Economic Research, the Institute of Faith Work in Economics, and the Independent Institute. He publishes in a wide variety of scholarly journals, and he's well known by media correspondence and occasionally contributes to various commentaries and other articles in Forbes in U.S. Today. So, with great delight, I would like to introduce all of you to Art Carden. Art.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I was a graduate student at Washington University, well, I guess they're calling it the Washington University now. Before it was the Washington University, I was a graduate student here from 2001 to 2006, during about the first half of Albert Pujols' first run with the Cardinals, which was amazing and magical. Then they didn't win the World Series until our left. We'll make it that what we can. I remember attending discussion club events when I was a graduate student, having an enormous amount of fun at discussion club events and thinking, man, someday it would be really cool if I were able to speak to the discussion club. And I learned today that this is what the discussion club has turned into. So I can check that off on my bucket list. I've gotten to speak now to the discussion club. And let's see here. Right, put it away. So what are we talking about? Over the course of our next, say, half an hour or so, a little bit longer than that perhaps, and then our Q&A, we're going to ask about Dennis at our doorstep. You might have seen the Monty Python movie, Monty Python and the Quest of the Holy Grail. You might remember Dennis, the peasant, scratching the ground and mucking about. We're going to ask what would happen if our ancient ancestor Dennis were to show up at our doorstep. Where would we take him? Then, what we're going to do is we're going to look at things that do not explain the difference between Dennis's life and our life. We'll look then at things that do explain the difference between Dennis's life and our life. Then finally, I'll say a word or two or three or four about what, if anything, we can do about it, what we should do, and the kinds of public policies and cultural themes, perhaps, that might expand and build on this great enrichment that we've enjoyed in the Western world for about the last 2.5, maybe 3 centuries. So, first, one of our ancient ancestors shows up on our doorstep. Maybe he's zapped through a time machine from 500 years ago, or 5,000 years ago, or 1,500 years ago, or something like that. Shows up on our doorstep, he kind of gets his bearings. And what we want to do now is we want to show exactly how the lives that we live today in 2023 differ from the life that he lived 500 years ago, or 5,000 years ago, or 1,500 years ago. I want to know, where would we take him? Where would we take him if we were trying to figure out, or if we're trying to show him how different his life is from ours? Now, granted, if he'd gone from 5,000 years ago to 500 years ago, things really wouldn't have been that different. Life would have been solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short for him and his children, just as it is for too many people in the world today, and just as it was for people for the better part of history. And kind of considering this, I thought, where would we take Dennis in order to show him just how different our lives are from his? And I'm going to ask you guys, where would you take Dennis to show him how very different our lives are from his? Yes, the supermarket. The supermarket. The supermarket. Okay. My own answer is basically exactly that. I would take Dennis to either a Walmart supercenter, or a Target supercenter, or maybe even a Costco. These are some of the answers that I get from time to time. Because this would help Dennis to see just how very, very different our world is from his. Okay, in a Walmart supercenter, you've got half of it's a supermarket, half of it is dry goods. In fact, actually, this occurred to me once while walking around in a Walmart center, and I was thinking about just how utterly marvelous, utterly unique it is as a piece of the overall human experience, as a piece of economic history. In part, I looked around and I saw just the sheer, unbelievable array of goods available to people even of relatively modest means. So you've got meat, peas, breakfast cereal, bread, the stacked floor to ceiling with groceries. It's also stacked floor to ceiling with clothing and office supplies and electronics and all sorts of other things. Things that the kings and queens of yesteryear could not have imagined. But the thing that really strikes me about going to a Walmart supercenter, or going to Schnucks, or going to Deerbergs, or going to Target, or going anywhere, any modern retail outlet, is not just the stuff that's available, but the clientele. The clientele. If you go to Walmart and you look around, or you go to a Schnucks and you look around, or you go to a Deerbergs or Target and you look around, the people who are shopping there are not the powdered lords and ladies. They're not the 1% necessarily, or if they are the 1%, they're indistinguishable more or less from everybody else. What makes a trip to Walmart or Target or Deerbergs or Schnucks truly remarkable is the fact that all of these goods, all of this stuff, all of these improvements in our lives are available to people of relatively modest means. Going to a Walmart supercenter in Birmingham, Alabama, it absolutely staggers the imagination to think that there's this cornucopia available at low prices, meaning that there's relatively little the sweat of our brow we have to exchange for it, to people who are by and large the descendants not of kings, not of queens, not of, again, powdered lords and ladies, but of slaves, of peasants, of tenant farmers, of people who were illiterate, of the peasant, of kind of the least of these among us. The world we inhabit today is remarkable in its difference. And what Deirdre McCloskey and I set out to do in our book, Leave Me Alone or I'll Make You Rich, is to explain that. We have, in short, what we call the greatest story never told. And if we look at most of history, the way that the journalist Jonah Goldberg described it in his book Suicide in the West is depressing but accurate. He wrote, "The natural state of mankind is grinding poverty, punctuated by horrific violence, terminating with an early death. It was like this for a very, very long time. The human experience for the better part of our history has been miserable. It's been solitary, it's been poor, it's been nasty, it's been short. Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish. I missed that one. I forgot that one a second ago. And short, whereas today it's the opposite of all of these. It's connected. It is rich. It is clean. It's relatively peaceful. And we lived for a very, very long time. With my mentor and Dr. Ferrarini's Douglas North explained it in his 2006 book, is that economic history is a depressing tale of population leading to famine, starvation, defeated warfare, economic stagnation and decline, and indeed the disappearance of entire civilizations. It wasn't short of Hobbesian nightmare of solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. What needs to be explained, we think, is not war, it's not poverty, it's not the decline and disappearance of civilizations, because these are the natural state of mankind. You have to do nothing to be poor. People fight. It's what we do. What we need to explain, again, is why we get lives that are long, why we get lives that are clean, why we get lives that are rich, why we get lives that today are so rich in not just material goods and services, but also connections, spiritual goods, opportunities to connect, and so on. Indeed, if we look at some of the data, we went from living in a world that was almost completely empty for the better part of our existence as a species, to a world that's just mostly empty. Not completely empty, but just mostly empty. We went from a world of a few million, maybe a few hundred million, maybe a few tens of millions, to a world of now over 8 billion people, and 8 billion people living longer than any of our ancestors did. I'll be 44 years old on Sunday, which means that if I were in England in 1800, I'd be living on borrowed time because life expectancy in England in 1800 was about 40, maybe a little bit less. And England, of course, in 1800 was one of the richest parts of the world. Today, even in Nigeria and countries in Africa that are among the poorest parts of the world, life expectancy is half again as long as it was in some of the richest parts of the world just a few short centuries ago. There are more of us. We're living a lot longer. We're consuming a lot more stuff. The amount of output, the amount of finished goods and services per person in the world has increased dramatically. It went from about $3, maybe $4 a day worth of goods and services, worth of food, clothing, and shelter every day for every person on average, to now over $100 a day in some parts of the world. Indeed, just for perspective, I spent about $3.50 in a cup of coffee this afternoon. Imagine having just $3.50 for all of the food, the clothing, and shelter that I would eat, I would sleep under, I would wear during the day. It staggers the imagination to think about how very different the average experience of people a couple hundred years ago, several thousand years ago even, is from the experience of the average person today. This is what really brings it home for me. This is what really brings it home for me. And these graphs are from an amazing website called Our World in Data. And it shows, again, what I think is the most important feature of the modern world. And that is the absolute decline in the number of people living in extreme poverty. The absolute decline in the number of people living in extreme poverty in the world. Again, for the better part of history, almost everyone lived in what the World Bank would describe as extreme poverty. And indeed, we can kind of point at that there. Almost everybody's living in extreme poverty at, I think that's what, $1.90 a day in 2011 dollars. Things go on, things go on, things go on, things go on. I'm born right around here in 1979. And right around the time that I'm born is also right around the time that China and India are starting to liberalize and adopting what we call the Bourgeois Deal. The number of people in the world living in extreme poverty begins to fall, while the number of people in the world, period, is growing explosively. Now, there are about, I believe, 500 million or so people in the world living in extreme poverty, which is 500 million too many. But 500 million out of 8 billion is very, very different from, say, 900 million out of 1 billion. Let's see, what's that, about 2 centuries ago. And that's what I want to explain. First thing I want to do is say a few words about what it wasn't. What didn't cause this great enrichment? And there are a lot of worthy and wonderful things that we've done more of, and that we should do more of, that might explain a few percentage points of the change over long periods of time, but that don't do all of the explanatory work. Specifically, saving. Right now, we're talking about personal finance in my principles of macroeconomics class. I'm telling my students they should save more, trying to sound like their dad, I guess, and also kind of coming to grips with the fact that I'm actually old enough now to be their dad. But I'm telling them they need to save more. However, saving more, as wise as it is for the individual and as wise as it is for a large society, doesn't really do a whole lot to explain long-run economic growth, and in particular, big increases in standards of living. Because if we save more, we just get more of the same tools that we've always had and always used. More of the same tools we've always had and always used. We save more, and we get more of the four-function calculators that we used 50 or 60 years ago. Okay. Well, that's going to improve things a little bit, but diminishing marginal returns means that the improvements are going to be limited and more limited the more we pile up. So saving might explain a few percentage points of what we're really trying to explain, but it doesn't do the whole job. It wasn't because of science. And here again, what we're trying to explain is a roughly 30 to 100-fold improvement in standards of living for people in the West, and a roughly 10-fold improvement in standards of living for the average person around the world. And science, as great as it is, as wonderful as it is, and much more of it as we should have, again, might explain a few percentage points of the change, but it does not explain much more than that. And furthermore, if you look at the history of science and technology, the general trend in the history of science and technology has not been that we make basic scientific discoveries and then we figure out how to use them. It has been that we figure out how to do something, or we start doing something, and then only much later do we figure out how it works. Humans were baking bread for a long time before they understood chemistry. People have been brewing beer for a long time before they understood chemistry. Lionel Messi, an example I used earlier today, arguably the greatest soccer player in history. There's a great little show you can find on YouTube called Sports Science, and it will go through, it'll discuss like the basic science behind the stuff you see on athletic fields. And I remember seeing an episode talking about the physics of what Lionel Messi is able to do with a soccer ball, and it's fascinating. However, Lionel Messi is able to do all of that without necessarily understanding the underlying physics. It's cool that we figured it out. And furthermore, understanding those physics might improve his performance a little bit, might help him train better, but it's hardly necessary for him to be, again, possibly and arguably the greatest soccer player the world's ever seen. We should have more science. Science is great, science is awesome, science makes us better off. But if we're trying to explain the Great Enrichment that happened beginning roughly in about the middle of the 18th century, science does not do the explanatory work. It wasn't because of stadiums. I have to throw this one in here. It wasn't because of big government projects or big bits of government spending or giant things that governments did as a result of the New Deal or elsewhere. Okay. Indeed, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that big government projects, which might involve expenditures of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars even, have, if anything, a negative rate of return. So spending money on big projects, again, Hoover Dam, we'll say, might be an example, or the Gateway Arch, or Protective Life Stadium in Birmingham, which we opened up a couple of years ago. If anything, these are probably net drags on the economy. So big visionary government public works, not doing a job there. Finally, as we're thinking about things that it wasn't because of slavery. It wasn't because of slavery or exploitation. Let me see, is this working here? Okay, there we go. It wasn't because of slavery and various kinds of exploitation. Now, this is an unfortunately common explanation in a lot of places, and at a lot of times, people have put forth the hypothesis and claimed that we, in countries like the United States and Great Britain and elsewhere, owe our prosperity to slavery, imperialism, and colonialism, to exploitation and episodes of exploitation over the course of history. This doesn't get the explanatory job done for a handful of reasons. First, as the historian Neil Ferguson put it, imperialism was the least original thing that Europeans did after 1492. Imperialism was the least original thing that the Europeans did after 1492. If merely having a gigantic empire were enough to create a great enrichment of the average person, then it would have happened somewhere else. It would have happened a long time ago. Empires are ancient in human history. Colonies are ancient in human history. Genocide is ancient in human history. Slavery is again one of the least unique institutions in the history of the human species. For as long as there have been people, there's been slavery. And once again, if slavery were enough to explain a general great enrichment, then it would have happened a long time ago. It would have happened somewhere else. Now, this is not to say that slavery, imperialism, colonialism, etc., didn't enrich a small handful of people. The folks who owned slaves, for example, and their descendants might have been enriched by this. Cecil Rhodes was obviously made a lot richer by imperialism and colonialism. The various crown heads of Europe are richer because of imperialism and colonialism. But that's not what we want to explain. What we want to explain and what we want to understand is why the average person, why the descendants of the enslaved, the descendants of the oppressed, the descendants of the colonized, people like us, normal, average, everyday people in countries around the world, have had this great enrichment of a tenfold to 30-fold to 100-fold increase in the goods and services available to us on a day-to-day basis. Okay. Slavery, imperialism, and colonialism were horrible. If anything, they had a negative effect on long-run economic growth. Might have been cool to be able to look at a map and say the sun never set on the British Empire, but the average guy in the pub was being taxed dearly in order to pay for it. So if it wasn't those things, what was it? It was, we argue, and a lot of other economists argue, because of new ideas. It was because of new ideas. We didn't get rich necessarily because we kept replicating the same grocery stores that the world had in the 1950s. We got rich because people like Heinrich Meyer, who owned some of those grocery stores, came up with new concepts in retailing, like what we today call the supercenter. We got rich because Sam Walton said, hey, look at all this technology we've had since the 1930s. Conveyor belts, trucks, warehouses, etc. We can rearrange this, cut a lot of fat out of the distribution system, and provide everyday low prices in the language of one of Walmart's mottos. It's because people came up with newer, better ways to do things. And they came up with newer and better ways to do things for a couple of reasons. First, because they had the liberty to do so. They didn't have to ask anybody's permission. Sam Walton didn't have to go before the retail board in order to start Walmart. Heinrich Meyer didn't have to go before the retail board in order to try something new and interesting. Saul Price, who eventually created what the modern warehouse club, didn't have to get permission from the retail board in order to do this. That sounds kind of obvious, but if we look at the jurisprudence of the New Deal era, say, had, say, the Schechter poultry case gone the other way, then that might have been the case. Maybe maybe a retail board would have been set up, and they would have needed permission from government regulators and quote unquote experts in order to do whatever it was they wanted to do with respect to things like retail innovation. It was because of liberty. It was because of dignity. It was because of dignity. Historically, people looked up to the fancy, the gods, the kings, the power lords and ladies I'm going to sort of go super nerd for just a second, because on Amazon Prime right now, the Kenneth Branagh version of Henry V is available to stream for free. And it's really, really, really good. Speaking of innovations, Amazon Prime, in fact, like just to digress for a second, my kids just cannot imagine that there was once a world in which if you wanted to watch something on TV, first of all, the family only had one TV or one screen of any kind on which to watch things. And second, you had to be in a specific place at a specific time. You couldn't just turn on your device, you know, fiddle with it just a little bit and watch whatever it is you wanted to watch pretty much anytime, anywhere. But toward the end of Henry V, he's conquered France, and he's saying to the French princess who's going to become his wife, "We're the makers of manners. Customs curtsy before great kings," I think is the way he said it. And that's cool, I guess. But one of the major things that changed is who we started to venerate, who we wanted to imitate, who we started to live up to. And while we still honor politicians, while we still honor great philosophers, perhaps, and things like that, there's also a lot more honor for people who run businesses, people who innovate, people who come up with cool new ideas. We take the names of people who have innovated, who have come up with new ideas, and now they adorn the names of business schools, colleges, universities around the country. Disruptive innovation for the last several years has been sort of the cool kid thing to do. Everybody wants to be a disruptor. Everybody wants to come up with the next Tesla, or the next Amazon, or the next ChatGPT, or the next Google, or the next fill in the blank, whatever the next thing is. The disruptors today are people we put on the covers of magazines like Forbes and Fortune, and newspapers like the Wall Street Journal that millions of people read every month and every year. It was not always this way. I'll give you an example. So in the year 829, this is from Rodney Stark's book, The Victory of Reason. In the year 829 AD, the Emperor Theophilus of Byzantium, was watching a merchant ship sail into the harbor. It was a beautiful, gloriously adorned merchant ship. And he said to his advisor, "Okay, well, who owns that merchant ship?" And they said, "Your wife does. Your wife has bought the merchant ship and is bringing all these goods in." He was furious. He ordered the ship be burned and said to his wife, "God has made me an emperor. You made me a ship's captain." Merely buy, sell, trade, and innovate was not something that the dignified, the power, the lords and ladies, the emperors were to do. And indeed, Theophilus' advisors praised him for doing so. Yeah, that's totally what an emperor should do. Because being a mere merchant is so far beneath him. And being a mere merchant is something that is meant for little people to do. It's beneath the time, the energy, the attention, the dignity of someone like this emperor. Today, if President Biden were to do something like that, were to burn a merchant ship as was coming into Los Angeles, if it was owned by anybody, a lot of us would think he's crazy, and with good reason. So we don't do things like that anymore, well, though we still do to a certain extent. But by and large, merely buying, merely selling, merely innovating, merely coming up with cool new ideas has taken on a sort of new luster in the world we live in, and that ultimately has been what has made us rich. Now, it raises the question: why are the people at Walmart and Costco there for me? What's this have to say about economic system? And this, I think, is a really important and profound question that speaks to issues related to the dignity of the human person, first of all, and related to the ways that people are able to interact in a complex society. One of my favorite games to play when I travel is, what did I leave at home? Because inevitably, I open my suitcase and there's something I need, something I'm supposed to have that I don't have. Toothpaste, comb, something, razor, shaving cream. Last week I was in Wetumpka and Elmore, Alabama, and I got to my destination and discovered I needed a belt. It's pretty early in the morning. It's at 6:30-ish, and I need a belt. And I'm wondering, hey, where am I going to go get a belt? How will I find where to get a belt? Well, first, I was able to pick up my pocket supercomputer, which we paid a measly several $100s. With a few flicks of my thumb, I discovered, lo and behold, there's a Walmart about a mile and a half away. I was able to get my little pocket supercomputer to navigate me to the Walmart in a town I'd never been to. I was able to go into the Walmart, go find a couple of belts, and then, in fact, I should go buy the belts at the self-checkout line. The only person I talked to while I was there was the person who checked my receipt on my way out. Who's there for me? Who's there for me? There are a lot of people maybe who wish me well in a situation like that, but the people who were there for me were Walmart shareholders, Walmart executives, Walmart employees, and the lady there checking my receipt. Why were they there? No doubt, it's because they all woke up and said, you know what? There's an absent-minded economist who lives in Birmingham, and he's going to be in Wetumpka on the morning of, what was that? That was a week ago today. So the morning of March 9th, 2023, and he's probably going to need a belt. And getting up early is really no fun, but we're willing to do it with Dr. Carden. Literally, no one thought that. Literally, no one thought that. And yet they were there for me. Why? Because the best way for them to take care of the people and the causes and the issues that matter to them was to be there to take care of the issues and causes and things that matter to me. A bunch of strangers, people I don't know, people who may not like me if they met me, were there with a belt when I needed one. And I was there with money when they needed it. In short, one of Adam Smith's great lessons is exemplified in this. Smith wrote in 1776 in an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, and I quote, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interests." Liberty and dignity mean acknowledging that people do things, and we honor them for doing things out of regard, perhaps, for their own interests. Not necessarily because they want to help me, because they want to help their children, they want to help the people at their church, they want to help their neighbors. And lo and behold, it turns out that one of the best ways for them to do that is to be there for absent-minded strangers who find themselves in Wetumpka, Alabama, in need of a belt, and they needed perhaps all sorts of other things on March 9th, 2023 at 6:30 in the morning. So what do we do? What do we do? What are the action steps that say we in this room or we as a society can take? What can I, as the parent of a 14-year-old boy, 12-year-old girl, 10-year-old boy do to help them be positive, functioning, contributing members of a free and prosperous society? Well, I think there are a few things. First, private policy that I think is really important is to mind your own business. To mind your own business. This is biblical wisdom. This is social wisdom. Indeed, simply taking care of your day-to-day tasks and your day-to-day affairs, I would argue, is a fairly heroic act. I don't know that a lot of people really fully understand what they're doing when they show up at the office and they fill out an expense report correctly, or when they send an email correctly. Or I used to have a friend, we lived in Memphis for 6 years between living in St. Louis and living in Birmingham. I had a friend in Memphis who designed stores for Kroger. And I remember one day talking to my friend who designed stores for Kroger, and he said he like really wanted to do something to give back to the world. Like he really wanted to do something to help people. And my memory's failing me now, so I can't remember if we actually had this discussion or if I just thought about it. But I thought, man, he is doing something. He's feeding the hungry. He's feeding the world by creating a much more efficient way for them to find and procure groceries and things like that. Taking care of our day-to-day tasks, doing our job, and minding our own business, I would argue, is perhaps much more heroic and much more effective than sitting around all day thinking of all the other ways that we wish other people use their time and all the other things that we think that other people should do. As a matter of public policy, a scholar named Adam Thierer several years ago wrote a great book called Permissionless Innovation. And this, I think, is a fantastic phrase to describe what we need in the world as a matter of public policy. Nobody should have to ask anyone's permission to compete. Nobody should have to ask anybody's permission to innovate. Nobody should have to ask anybody's permission to change the way that people get, say, from point A to point B. One of the most recent examples of this in the last decade has been the advent of Uber and Lyft, ride-sharing services that have fundamentally changed the way that people get around. And this was interesting. This was interesting in part because of the big regulatory storm that was created in cities where Uber and Lyft tried to do business, like, for example, Birmingham. I'm sure something similar happened in St. Louis. Fortunately, Uber and Lyft and places like that, and companies like that, were able to overcome these barriers and were able to operate. We'll never know the extent to which there are other companies like Uber and Lyft that were never able to get off the ground because they tried to fight City Hall and they lost. Permissionless innovation is a key to long-run prosperity. One of the areas that I've studied in my research is retail. I've written a lot of papers about Walmart and have a new paper in a journal called Essays in Economic and Business History about kind of the late 20th century history of retail. And one of the most interesting characters in all of this is a guy named Saul Price, a name that is not a household name the way that, say, Sam Walton is. But Saul Price was a lawyer in San Diego. And in the early 1950s, he ended up in possession of a warehouse. And he had some clients who were doing business, selling watches and liquor, I think it was, to a store in Los Angeles called Fedco. So Price and his friends lived in San Diego. His colleague or his clients were doing business with the store in Los Angeles. They went up to visit the store at one point, and the store sold exclusively to federal employees. And one of the things they noticed was that a lot of people were making this long drive from San Diego to Los Angeles and back just to shop at Fedco. They thought, maybe this would work in San Diego. Saul Price at a warehouse. His friends had some ideas. They approached the Fedco people and said, hey, can we open a Fedco in San Diego? They said, no, we don't really want to expand to San Diego. Apparently, some of the folks from Fedco did visit, and they looked at the site and said, this will probably work, but we're not going to do a Fedco. So, undaunted, they started their own company, started their own store. They called it FedMart. FedMart was a roaring success in Southern California. In the late 1960s, Saul Price was actually forced out of his own company as part of kind of a hostile takeover. Undaunted again, in the early to mid 1970s, he and his son started an outfit called Price Club, a warehouse membership store that ran on a lot of the same principles that FedMart had. High inventory turnover, relatively few stock keeping units, membership only. It was the warehouse club. It was basically the first membership warehouse club. Fast forward a few years, the early 1980s, there's a guy named Jeffrey Brotman in Seattle who looks at the success of Price Club. And as I understand it, went to the board of directors of Price Club and went to the prices and said, hey, this really looks cool. I would like to start a Price Club in San Diego. Not San Diego, excuse me, Seattle. I'd like to start a Price Club in Seattle. Do you want to go in on this? I said, no. We're not gonna open a Price Club in Seattle right now. What Jeffrey Brotman did is he went and he hired Saul Price's right-hand man, a guy named Jim Senegal, who had been with Price for decades, and said, okay, you know a lot about the retail sector. Let's start our own company. And they started a little company called Costco in Seattle. About 10 years after that, Costco and Price Club merged. A few years after that, all Price Clubs adopted the Costco name. And now Costco is one of the leaders in the retail industry, providing people with high quality goods in enormous quantities at very low prices. I shudder to think of what would have happened had the Fedco people saying, no, we're not going to open a Fedco in San Diego been the end of the story. if salt price had needed permission from them in order to do business. The late 20th century would have been very different. I shudder to think what the world would have looked like had Costco saying to Jeffrey Brotman, yeah, no, we're not going to open had Price Club, said to Jeffrey Brotman, we're not going to open a store in Seattle. You do not have our permission. That's the end of it. Okay. The opportunity, the right to try cool new things, to have a go to venture one's own capital on something, permissionless innovation, in other words, is an enormous contributor, and indeed it is the contributor to the changes in standards of living we've enjoyed over these last 2.5 centuries or so. That's my story. And Deirdre McLaughlin's story. And it's something I continue to work on. I'm thrilled to be here. I consider it a great honor to be speaking tonight. I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody has. You can find me easily on the internet, art.carden@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter, I post there occasionally. Or Google pretty easily. You can find a lot of other stuff that I've said, done, written, etc. And I'm going to open up the floor now to questions.
So let's open the floor to questions. Any questions here? I have 17 students online, so we have a few questions there. But before we shift to the questions here, I'll give you the microphone.
It's been a lot of time studying recent history. Do you have any predictions? It would have been hard to predict in 1950 what 2020 would look like. What do you think for 20, 30, 50 years, or is it just innovation so hard to predict this?
Better. That's really about it. Innovation really is fundamentally difficult to predict, and it's hard to know what's going to succeed. If I knew what was going to succeed, then I would be presumably like, I'd cash out my 401k and I would put all my money into that because that's what's going to succeed and make a ton of money. Unfortunately though, again, it is almost impossible to know exactly what is going to succeed, what ideas are going to be good, what ideas are going to stick. When I was in college, no one would have said that you can make a lot of money as a social media manager. For example, because social media didn't exist yet. Nobody would have thought that Amazon would be poised probably to overtake Walmart, maybe, as the country's and indeed the world's leading retailer. This stuff had to be tried, and it had to be tested against people's willingness to pay. And that's actually something that's sort of important that McCloskey and I talk about, is the importance not just of people coming up with new ideas, but with people being able to test those new ideas in the market, where profits tell people do more of that and losses tell people do less of it. I wonder sometimes what would happen if new code had been a government program. Middle of the 1980s, you may know the story of one of the greatest marketing disasters in history when they reformulated Coca-Cola and people went berserk, okay, because they wanted their old Coke back. Well, Coke got the message pretty quickly. They brought back the original formula for Coke. New Coke, what came to be known as Coke 2, just kind of died out. If New Coke had been a government program, it would probably still be with us. If the Ford Edsel had been a government program, it would probably still be with us. One of the things I like to do periodically is look at lists of failed McDonald's menu items. One of my favorite examples in the history of McDonald's is the success of the Filet-O-Fish sandwich. And this gets to exactly this question about which innovations are going to succeed, which ones are going to fail. You had a guy who owned a McDonald's franchise in Cincinnati in the late 1960s. And he owned a franchise in a predominantly Catholic neighborhood. And so therefore he wasn't selling a lot of burgers on Fridays. Now then, me sitting in my office in Birmingham, Alabama, would know nothing about this predominantly Catholic neighborhood in Cincinnati. And indeed, some sort of government planner sitting in DC probably wouldn't know. We came up with this idea for the Filet-O-Fish. And it became, and is now still, a McDonald's menu item. At the same time, Ray Kroc, who founded McDonald's, came up with an idea for what he called the hula burger, which was a slice of pineapple and a slice of American cheese on a bun. And the hula burger is now one with Nineveh and Tyre. Okay. Its place in history is now on listicles detailing failed McDonald's menu items. Had the Hula Burger been a government program, it would probably still be with us once again. So it's almost impossible to know which innovations are going to succeed and which ones are going to fail. I'm optimistic that our lives will be better in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. I don't know exactly how, but I'm excited to see how it all turns out.
You mentioned Amazon.
Uh,
It amazes me that I can pick up the phone and in an hour, sometimes I just on the front porch.
Yep.
That makes me not go to the stores anymore. When I go to the stores, there are not cashiers because there are not enough people to pay for the cashiers. So we go to the automated system. So in my little mind, I'm thinking they're going to get me used to this. And then all of a sudden, it's not going to be free. And then the retail stores aren't going to be there anymore because they're not. What is your thought on that?
Yeah, so that's the sort of standard, or that's a usual theme, that some innovator will come up with some cool idea and then blow everybody else out of the water and then jack up the prices and things like that. One of the things that we do tend to see though is that stuff gets replaced. The big thing that everybody thinks is going to take over the world, in fact, it doesn't. In fact, actually, Amazon right now is involved in a big hearsay brawl with companies like Target and Walmart that are catching up to Amazon in terms of online retail. So retail is changing. Retail is changing, and indeed concentration may increase a little bit, but I'm really not that worried about, say, the end of retail being something like, Amazon owning and running everything. Because 15 years ago, 20 years ago, people had the same fear about Walmart. And a few decades before that, they had the same fear about Sears. And a few decades before that, they had the same fear about the Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. So it's plausible that might happen, but I don't think it's very likely because it seems like every time everybody gets afraid that some company is going to take over an entire industry or be the only company in the industry, something else comes along. One of my favorite examples of this is, I think it was in 2007 or so, I remember reading an article about how MySpace is what economists call a natural monopoly. That there are network effects, that there's a big setup cost to establishing a social network. The marginal cost of adding an additional person is zero. So therefore, MySpace was going to be the only social media company. It was inevitable. And lo and behold, here we are. None of my students, as far as I know, have ever used MySpace. Right around the same time, or in the middle of the 2000s, I think it was on Forbes of Fortune that ran a cover story asking if anybody would be able to unseat the cell phone king, which was Nokia. Was it Nokia? I think it was Nokia. It was Nokia or Ericsson. I think it was Nokia. Would anybody be able to unseat the cell phone king? Nokia. And lo and behold, here we are. Does anybody have a Nokia phone? Yeah. No one has a Nokia phone. They don't have a Motorola phone in the room. No one anymore is using some of these products. We have iPhones. We have little Samsung makes phones. Lots and lots and lots of different people, lots of different groups make phones now. I have never felt older and more out of touch with the world than I did this past Friday. When I was driving my daughter, who's 12, and some of her classmates for a school field trip. And they're sitting in the back of the car talking about whatever. And one of them says, "What's an iPod? I've never seen an iPod." And it was blowing my mind. They're talking about what is it? It's like a phone, you can't make calls. It's like we can download music on it. And they were mystified by the idea that there was one time this thing they couldn't use to text their friends on. And I think example after example after example like that make me fairly optimistic that Amazon is not the end of retail. So, there.
We have another question right there.
That's right. I'd like to hear a few more of your thoughts regarding your statement that large government projects usually aren't good for the economy as a non-economist. Just using the example, giant dam, I think, well, it makes hydroelectric power for tens of thousands of homes and maybe provides water for many farms. Thoughts on that?
So that's a really interesting question. And it's something like Hoover Dam may not have been the best of examples. So I'll talk about a couple of things here, though I'm still a little bit skeptical of something like Hoover Dam. So my colleague at the American Institute for Economic Research, Robert Wright, is a historian, and he writes like a new book every week, it seems like. And a new one that he's coming out with is on the New Deal. And one of the things I learned in reading the draft version of this book is about the history of the Tennessee Valley Authority and rural electrification as a result of the New Deal. And it sounds great. Rural electrification sounds awesome. But there are a lot of hidden costs to that. Such that it's by no means clear that the TVA represented a sort of a net increase in social welfare. First, there were a lot of towns and cities that were just flooded in order to create dams and things like that in the Tennessee Valley. Second, one of the things that Robert Wright points out is that this destroyed the market for windmills, it destroyed the market for battery technology, it destroyed the market for a lot of alternatives. So, while I'll grant the case of something like Hoover Dam or maybe a power plant, maybe could be something with positive rates of return. When I think about big government projects, a lot of time I'm thinking about various what some economists refer to as the Oedipus complex, which is if you build some giant thing, then people will come to look at that giant thing, or they'll come to watch sports at that giant thing, and that will create economic growth. And the best available evidence suggests that that really isn't the case. There are better things and worse things the governments can spend money on. If they're spending money on a hydroelectric dam, there's at least a plausible case to be made for that. If they're spending money on a stadium for a billionaire who owns a sports team, then that's another question entirely.
I guess the jury's still out on Hoover Dam. The lake there is, Lake Mead is losing water now at a tremendous rate. So I don't know if that's hurting a lot of people.
Yeah, well, I haven't studied Hoover Dam I haven't studied Hoover Dam specifically. It's something I think about when I think about the giant government project.
But my question is, permissionless marketing is getting harder and harder, it seems. And some of the people that are making it harder to get permissionless innovation are the very people that were the innovators at one time. And I think of the pharmaceutical industry as one of the prime examples where the people, the innovators of decades ago are now making it harder for other startups to innovate and are protecting themselves. And that seems to be a trend that's accelerating. Are you as optimistic now about the future, given all that?
Yes. So my look at the future is to say things are going to be much better than they are, but they're not going to be as good as they could be because of exactly the phenomenon that you're talking about, which is one of the first things that people do when they succeed, they try to pull up the ladder. And in the case of something like access to the pharmaceutical market, once you've innovated, once you're making your billions, if you can suddenly start farming VC for subsidies, protection, licensing, rules like that, then we observe a lot of companies doing, a lot of firms and a lot of individuals doing stuff like that. One area of work I'm looking into right now is the constitutional political economy of an economist named William Harold Hutt, who spent most of his career in South Africa, and it's just an absolutely fascinating character. But one of the things I've been looking into is his critique of South African racial policy. So in 1964, he published a book called The Economics of the Color Bar. You can actually find a PDF of it online. And it's basically a devastating critique of South African labor regulation, which in the years leading up to World War II was just called the color bar, where a lot of jobs were specifically reserved for whites only. And then after 1948, it became what we all know as apartheid. is grossly inefficient and grossly unfair. But for the beneficiaries, the members of white labor unions, workers in industries, where they're earning higher incomes because Native workers are excluded, a pretty strong incentive to do things like what they did, which was march through the streets of Johannesburg, chanting things like "Unite and fight for a white South Africa," and things like that. So, as I've gotten older, I'm more and more leaning behind the idea that, well, what people need to do is just listen to the company. Good for them. And it really kind of trying to understand more and more, how are we able to get things like innovation, given exactly these sort of phenomena that people have incentive to push back on, push back against it once they do it.
We have other questions. Okay, we have 17 people who are joining us online, so thank you very much for the people who are here. One of the questions we have from the people online is, can you speak more to the relationship between savings and investment, assuming that the savings is being channeled into investments? And because we have a young audience, can you talk about cryptocurrencies?
Okay, so I'm going to say the cryptocurrency thing first. No, I can't really talk about cryptocurrency. I'm still not sure I understand how the blockchain works. And I have a friend who's actually he's now in a blockchain startup. So one of my rules of thumb is if it's something I fundamentally don't understand, I probably shouldn't put my money there. So I am still agnostic on crypto. With respect to saving and investment, this is a really good question, because one of the things actually we're talking about right now in the macroeconomics class I teach is that we make a fairly heroic assumption about saving being handled into investment. And that requires development of a financial system. And it requires a certain degree of financial sophistication. One of the things that has become a problem, particularly in the wake of the Great Recession, has been the fact that you have entities that are considered too big to fail, like Goldman Sachs, I think Bank of America. I forget exactly which institutions are considered too big to fail, and they have fairly strong incentives to protect their position in the marketplace. So maybe we don't get as much financial innovation as we would get, and financial intermediation is perhaps not as efficient. We've been fortunate, again in the West, that financial markets have worked reasonably well for the last several centuries. That we've come up with ideas like, marine insurance and various innovations like that. But this is a really good question, because it's true that translating saved resources or translating saving into investment requires a lot of financial intermediation that's not necessarily going to be automatic.
That's a great response. Thank you very much. I think we're in the same place in our macro courses.
Good.
Another question addresses the ESG initiatives, and then where does that play a role here? Do we need those types of initiatives in order to get prosperity that's sustainable and will leverage the sustainability and the prosperity of the past?
So I'm with Milton Friedman in that I believe that the social responsibility of the corporation is to increase its profits. It's a breach of fiduciary duty to try to engage in social engineering with one shareholder's money. That's more and more a minority view. But while I think it's important, to have noble goals and noble ideals, simply having noble goals and noble ideals is not sufficient for noble outcomes. My intellectual hero is an economist named Thomas Sowell. And one of my proudest moments as a father is my 14-year-old and my 10-year-old both did their Black History Month projects on Thomas Sowell. So one of my favorite Sowell books my favorite Sowell book is called Conflict of Visions. And Sowell is famous for saying that there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. There are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And furthermore, you have to actually look at the effects of what's happening rather than merely the intentions of the people who are proposing this policy or that policy or the other policy. No decent person would think it's a bad thing for the poor to be fed and clothed and housed, but merely wishing for things to be that way that's not going to be sufficient for it to actually happen. Merely having ESG initiatives does not necessarily mean that we're going to get ESG outcomes. And I'm skeptical of the movement intellectually, I'm skeptical of it morally, and I'm skeptical of it economically.
Okay, and there, wait, whoop, we go.
Speaking of saving and investments, what is the trend for the younger generation now? Are they saving, are they investing, are they spending? What is the trend?
I love the data. But I think there is, I believe, a tendency for like every generation to think that the generation coming after them is being propagated this solution, but then by the time they reach adulthood, they're doing really well. I think the millennials, for example, I'm just on the other side of being a millennial, are actually being more responsible for resources now than they once were. We talked about how to get rich by saving and investing in my principles and macro class the other day. And pretty frequently students will, as a result of that, I'll get a lot of emails from students saying that they started saving and investing more as a result. I have to actually look at the data to see what saving rates look like relative to previous generations, but I'm not sure. I don't know that the young are being disproportionately irresponsible with money. It might look like it sometimes because, but part of that I think is an artifact of increases in life expectancy, where, you know, when life expectancy was 50, then you lived a third of your life by the time you're about 16 years old. When life expectancy is 80 or 90, then you're into your mid to late 20s by the time you live a third of your life. So people are spending more time in college, more time acquiring training and things like that, and they're getting started a little bit later. But one of the reasons they are getting started a little bit later is they're expecting, I think, a little off it.
Good question.
Yeah, these are great.
I know, right?
Talked about government and innovation. How about talking about government and education and innovation? Certain states are trying to take over and educate. How is that? What does that really look like in terms of?
I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but governments are by and large sworn enemies of educational innovation, even though they may talk a big game about it. It's really, really hard to have innovation without competition. Okay, or it's really hard to have meaningful, valuable, productive innovation without competition because you don't have market tests. You don't have market tests or even anything really approaching market tests that will help people figure out what's working and what isn't. And in the case of education, the fact that we don't have, or the fact that in a lot of cases, education provided by a local monopolist means that it's not as good as it could be. And furthermore, that local monopolist really doesn't have much in the way of incentive to get any better. I read years ago a very interesting study in the Journal of Urban Economics on urban school districts. And one of the things it pointed out, and one of the things that the economists who wrote the article claimed, is that one of the reasons why suburban school districts tend to be so much better than urban school districts is because suburbs are competing with one another. They're competing with one another for residents. And while it's not exactly identical to free market competition, at the very least, one of the ways that a city is able to attract residents and therefore to attract taxpayers is by having good schools. So, of course, obviously, it's a huge deal in a city like St. Louis. Also evident in Birmingham, where in some of the suburbs of Birmingham, for example, Hoover, Vestavia Hills, Mountain Brook, the people who are choosing to live there are a lot more mobile than people who live in the city of Birmingham. Our own children we live in Birmingham, our own children go to an unaccredited private school. And if it were not for the option to do that, or the option to homeschool, we would probably live long so. So, I am a little bit more optimistic about that in the wake of COVID. So a scholar named Great Enrichment, who's doing positive heroic work on, first of all, understanding the economics of school choice, and second, trying to move the policy needle on school choice. And I think that the way that a lot of districts, the way that a lot of public schools comported themselves during and immediately after the COVID pandemic, really, I think, alienated a lot of people. Just use one example, while a lot of teachers in Alabama were like dancing around at the state capitol wearing hazmat suits and talking about how endangered they felt, like the school our kids go to, they were having like their last day of school graduation ceremony at a bar. So I think we're going to see a lot more movement out of the old into stuff like that.
Okay, any last questions? And keep going, I love it.
So it's hard not to notice how left-wing most American universities have become, and I'm
Yep.
just curious, is your university, Samford, an exception to that rule? How did you get
It very much
into
is.
this?
Yeah, so it very much is.
I only started hearing about it in the last several years,
Okay.
and I don't know where it came from.
Oh, this is a great question because I get to talk about my employer, which is awesome. So Samford University is a school. It's unique in that it is both it's a very serious place intellectually, and it's also a very serious place spiritually. It's a very seriously, very intentionally Christian school that doesn't sacrifice on the spiritual margin. It also doesn't sacrifice on the intellectual margin, which is kind of like, that's really hard to do in a lot of ways, because sometimes people want to control the school doctrinally, or they want to jettison the doctrine and turn Samford into, or turn any university into just like everybody else. And in terms of its leanings, students and faculty are probably a lot more conservative than they are in other places. We do have the same thing with stuff that other places deal with, but by and large, it's a place for people who are intellectually fearless. And I really enjoy being here. They're excellent colleagues, they're able to ask really interesting and excellent questions. One of the best examples of this is, I'm sort of hesitate to say this, given that it's being broadcast on the internet, but like my best sort of example of the kind of place that Samford is probably 8 or 9 years ago now. At the time, the provost was walking through the cafeteria with his daughter and saw me and one of my colleagues and said, "Oh, there's Dr. Carden and Dr. Marshall, and they can talk about statistics and economics." We're having this conversation, and I see there's a little tent on the table advertising the debate team topics. And the debate team topics the coming year are on whether or not drugs and prostitution should be legalized. And something in my brain misfired. I said, "You know what you really need to do right now is talk to the daughter of your provost, who is a Baptist minister, about why we should legalize drugs and prostitution." And so I started making this argument, and he's ready to go. He's like, "Let's have this argument. Let's have this discussion. Let's have this debate." Even though these are, let's just say that Southern Baptists, and I am one, we tend not to be very libertarian on things like drugs and prostitution. But he was ready to go. He was all about the ideas. Samford was and remains, I hope, all about the ideas, and I hope that it continues to be that way.
Should I call it now? Because I think that we are at our last question. Thank you so much. All right, join me in congratulating Art and Joe. We appreciate your insights. We appreciate the conversation and the discussion. Our hope is that you continue this conversation through us as well as other events. We have a variety of people and entities that have sponsored and made tonight possible. Of course, it's the Institute for Free Enterprise, in Lindenwood University. We have Lindenwood University, the larger campus that we appreciate. And Northwood University has also supported us and we are supporting them. We're trying to make what we do something truly national, and our ultimate goal is to be international. So let all of you know, our big event that's coming up next is on March 30th. Please set your reminders on your phone and join us on the campus at Lindenwood University. We will be in Dunset and we will have a business ethics panel. Steve Coleman is going to be on that panel and they're going to talk about some precarious situation where they face trade-offs and they involve ethics. And we just were on a conversation earlier today about the ChatGPT. We were talking about that and the ethics involved in the trade-offs. There will be a buffet lunch provided and you'll be able to interact more with the faculty and the students. So our hope is that not only do you join us, but you invite others too. And then finally, please stay in touch, support the Hammond Institute. You know, friend us, like us, tweet it out, because our success depends on you, and hopefully your success depends on us. Because at the end of the day, it's not about me, and I. It's about we, and us, and we want to remember that at the heart of everything we do is students in the community. So with that, I'm going to conclude tonight's program. We will see you when? March 30th at the Business Ethics Panel. And we have two things for you, business-wide, right? Parking slips for all of you. If you parked in the lot, please just go to the back table and you can pick one of these up. That would be great. And then we actually have adult beverages as well as non-alcoholic ones and a few hors d'oeuvres. So please mingle and mark your calendars. We'll see you hopefully on March 30th. Thank you, everyone.